Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. We're staring down the barrel of a presidential election, one that highlights deep questions about democracy and political participation. If our goal is radically more freedom, how should we think about democracy's place in achieving that, given that the popular will often isn't for more freedom? And if the system, as it exists, is rather far from fully just, how should we approach participating in it? These are questions libertarians and others raise frequently, and they're worth taking more seriously than most people do. To help us think through them, I'm joined by my good friend Andy Craig. He's a fellow in liberalism at the Institute for Humane Studies and an expert on election laws and democratic theory. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported project. If you like the show and want to get early access to new episodes, consider becoming a supporter. You can learn more and sign up for the free newsletter companion to this podcast by heading to reimaginingliberty.com. And stick around to the end of today's episode for a preview of my next discussion, available now in early access for supporters. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Andy. In November, we have a presidential election during which I think a compelling and strong case can be made that democracy itself is on the ballot. And the future of our democratic liberal institutions are on the ballot. At the same time, libertarians and many fellow travelers for a long time have expressed a certain skepticism about democracy and democratic institutions on the grounds that taking decisions away from the individual and dispersing them widely is still taking decisions away from the individual that rightly belong to the individual. And so a democratic institution telling you to do something is still a violation of your rights in a way similar to if some other agent of the state did. And so our concern about rights and liberties and the concentration of power are not quite ameliorated by democratic institutions. And that's a tension now in the current political environment, because the alternative that is on offer to democracy does not look to be particularly libertarian or rights or liberty regarding. And so I thought it would be interesting to dig in with you, seeing as you are my go-to person on thinking about issues of democracy and elections and so on, to dig into that tension. So I guess for an audience of libertarians or radical liberals or people generally skeptical of state power, how should we think about democracy?
Well, you're absolutely right. That's a long-running thing in libertarianism, not only skepticism to kind of begrudging acceptance of electoral democracy, but it's partly because of the historical context in which modern 20th century libertarianism arose, post-war United States, where explicitly anti-democratic politics was not something really, it was a background assumption that they didn't really need much interrogating on the level of, yes, we have elections for president and Congress and in the states and all that. But this is a contrast to the preceding classical liberal heritage that libertarianism came out of. If you look to the 19th century and the late 18th century classical liberals, they understood that democracy and freedom were two sides of the same coin, that they weren't separable in the way that sometimes some libertarians have imagined, that bringing power under the rule of law, that having peaceful, orderly ways for deciding our social disputes, including disputes over claims of right. There are certain fundamental rights that we properly put behind entrenched constitutional protections, things like free speech, things like free association, at least some minimum of private property, so that you can have the individual autonomy, which is what you're taking the inputs from in a democratic system, as imperfect as it is. where you have to have free people to have in any real sense democracy. And so liberal democracy is a coherent package. You do not ever get governments that actually do respect rights and that don't end up in some bloody awful collapse or coup or something like that, that don't suppress free speech and free association and that respect civil liberties. There's no such example of that. There are some relatively free market-ish ones. You can point to Singapore as a common example, or Hong Kong before recent events would get cited. But even in those cases, whatever free market-ish things you have, you didn't have all these other personal fundamental rights. And so the whole syllogism and logic of the Declaration, starting from all are created equal, leads into freedom, but it also leans into one man, one vote, or one person, one vote these days. And the idea of having a liberal autocracy or an undemocratic liberal regime has always been tempting, just like it's tempting to any ideology that think it has it all figured out and knows the entire ideal up and down policy set on everything, to say, well, we can't put this stuff up for a vote anymore. We can't, it just needs to be locked in. And you can't really get that because it shuts down the need of persuasion and buy-in, that you're not going to get these ideal policies and rules that we want and laws without having the broad, stable social buy-in that this is freely chosen by the collective, by the society as a whole. And so those are all some of the reasons I think the traditional libertarian skepticism of democracy has been a little bit misplaced, both on the theoretical level and the practical reality of what we see in the world.
There's a lot in there that I want to unpack, but also put on my hardcore libertarian hat and push back on or raise the objections. The first, though, is I'll approach what you just said from the hardcore democracy proponent side of things. And so you started off by talking about there are certain rights that we basically take out of the political sphere. We say, okay, our political processes, including democratic processes, get to make all kinds of decisions about what the laws of the land are going to be. But there are going to be certain things, certain rights that we say, but they don't get to make a decision on that. No matter how many people want to take away your free speech rights or take away your right to exercise your religion and so on, we're not going to let them. But what that means in practice is those rights aren't self-enforcing. And as we both know, how you can state a right, but then how it applies in a given situation is often complicated. And so you need someone to interpret the right and then call for enforcement of it or let it erode a bit in the face of democratic pressures. And those people aren't selected by the democratic process, say, or not, those issues are not voted on by the people. And so you've taken interpretation out of their hands. And so I'm thinking there's a lot of people on the left who are very mad at the contemporary Supreme Court, not just because it happens to have a 6-3 conservative majority, but because they view the decisions that it makes as illegitimate, unconstitutional, wrong in various ways, but you can't do anything about it. And calls for reform often get criticized by, say, libertarians as court packing or whatever, removing the independence of the judiciary. And so it does seem like there is this concern that if we probably don't want full democratic decision making of everything. Everyone's rights are on the ballot at every election. But we need a mechanism within our liberal institutions for determining what those rights are. And then that mechanism ends up sounding like the single person rule that you just said doesn't work, or the small group rule, or the anti-democratic rule. And so how do we square that?
That is something that gets brought up a lot from the kind of we want more majoritarian rule on the left. And the thing to understand about it is this is a sliding scale. And when we talk about fundamental rights, constitutional rights protections, and anti-democracy as such, that we weren't going to have a limited franchise or some other than public vote to pick whatever officers of the state we do still have, um, are on kind of opposite ends. And the way to think about it when you're looking at these things as protections on liberty, um, is the breadth of the coalition needed, the number of people who have to solve their coordination problem in order to wield power. And so the constitutional amendment process and the court, including the mechanism by which the judges are indirectly appointed, so you have some political accountability, but it's also deliberately insulated from it. These are all supermajority mechanisms. These are things where you cannot, under the law, change this thing or overrule this less democratic institution unless you have a broad, under our system, bipartisan consensus on a level higher than a simple democratic majority. Whereas if you talk about the ideas of restricting the franchise or giving some people more votes or down the line, into outright autocracy, that's shrinking the breadth of the coalition you need, ultimately down to a fairly small number of people. And so that has an illiberalizing effect that is somewhat distinct from just this, do we want everything decided by 50% plus one, which is a common libertarian thing to go to, but that's really a little bit of a straw man. Nobody really wants or advocates that. When we talk about democracy, everyone understands this means liberal democracy, and both half of that term means something, that you have to have fundamental rights protected, that you have to have the rule of law and a constitutional order that is stable and all those other things. And that's what we mean in the world today when we talk about democracies and we look at democracies versus the rest of the world. It's just taken for granted because everyone knows that includes the constitutional liberalism part of it, which is necessary to have any kind of meaningfully real democracy. The alternative that gets posited of, absolute simple majority rule is not sustainable. It's not a real thing that we call democratic because it doesn't protect those rights of speech and association and all the rest of it that go into having free and fair elections.
Let me flip it now then. You mentioned that the one benefit of a democratic system is buy-in, is that we recognize when it comes to making political decisions, there's a process. Everyone, with the exception of people under the age of 18 and resident non-citizens, and in some states, felons. So we carve out lots of exceptions, but everyone has a say in this, but you don't always get what you want. And so that process can lead to an outcome that's suboptimal to you, that you don't prefer, or in some cases is just hugely harmful to you. Think about the processes in Florida that led to don't say gay laws or lead to stripping people of access to health care and so on. And it seems unsatisfying to say to someone whose rights have been taken away by this system, you had a say. Like you could vote against these laws, but if most of the people of Florida want to drive trans people out of public life, well, that's what the democratic process settled on. Or look ahead to November. The election looks awfully close right now. Either side could win it fair and square. Trump, it seems unlikely he was going to win the popular vote, but maybe if he was running against Biden, he could have won the popular vote. But a lot of people would said, I didn't buy into that. Like there are limits to what I'm willing to buy into. My voice was not heard. If you're a small enough minority, then you know that you're basically shouting into the void because you need something close to 50% of people to be on your side in order to ever have your voice heard. And so it seems like for a lot of libertarians, they hear that argument about buy-in and essentially treat it as a fable or an illusion, that this is a story we tell ourselves in order to justify this power or legitimize this power, but the buy-in is like a trick that we play on ourselves, and we don't actually have any meaningful say in this system.
It is the case that democratic politics and democratic institutions can produce horribly unjust outcomes. We have a lot of examples of that, things that go back, all the way to Jim Crow and slavery, and suppression of LGBT rights and all these sorts of things, racial discrimination. But ultimately, it's the case that there's no shortcut. There's no way around needing some degree of social consensus and general buy-in to the legitimacy of the system of the state, even when you do lose an election, even when you have terribly unjust laws. The Declaration talks about, and this goes back a long way, that violent revolution, which is ultimately what you're talking about in the extreme cases of resisting these injustices, is for good reason a last resort. It can sometimes be justified. It's relatively rare that it reaches that point under a democratic system, as opposed to situations like the American Revolution, where we weren't represented in parliament, or undemocratic regimes and that kind of thing. But having this mechanism is what makes it possible to win by persuasion. Without that, there is only the resort to violence, because there genuinely is no feedback mechanism. And we have a lot of examples throughout the whole march of American history where minorities did ultimately vindicate their rights through the democratic process by winning majority support, including when it was done through the courts. I mean, there's a reason it took the century of courts to get there, and it's because public opinion had moved in a broad sense, and there was national majorities behind desegregation and abolishing Jim Crow. So when we're looking at it, I think that's the thing that's, it's literally true, this point that individuals, we have not actually consented. The social contract is not a thing where, sign on the dotted line, yes or no. It doesn't matter if you're not a voter. It doesn't matter if you reject the legitimacy of the state. The state will come and use its monopoly on force to enforce whatever the case may be on you. But that doesn't mean there's no such thing as social acceptance and things that only work because they have not just majority, but effective supermajority consensus. I mean, even if you look at January 6th, the worst attack on American democracy, at least since Jim Crow, that was a few thousand people. That wasn't half the country rising up in arms against the result. And if you did have that, then it would not, that's not a preferable scenario to having these majoritarian consensus and to having a theory of what the fundamental rights are, as opposed to the other disputable claims of right, things like, the tax rate, that are and do need to be within a more democratic decision-making process, because they are disputed, because we do have a lack of all-encompassing social consensus about the answers to those questions. And so that's the thing to keep in mind. All these routes to more freedom with less democracy don't actually pan out in any, from the historical record, in any real case we can see.
Does democracy require a certain public spiritedness in order to work, or a certain degree of regard for others? Because we all have our interests, and we want to vote our interests. But what's narrowly in our own interests might be very, very much against the interests of others. And so we could, you and I could disagree on the marginal tax rate, and both think that our view, I think it should be X, you think it should be Y, and both think that, if we get our way, it's both good for us, but it's also good for the country. Maybe you think that higher tax rates lead to greater government revenue that leads to better services that you would benefit from, but others would benefit from as well. Maybe I think that lower tax rates lead to more economic growth that benefits me, but also benefits a growing economy, benefits everyone else. And we can have that kind of reasonable disagreement about it. But that's done in this sense of public spiritedness. So you're taking both your own interests into account and those of everyone else. But it seems like a lot of the time people are instead motivated much more narrowly than that. So imagine a candidate who says he's going to give you and your 10 buddies $10 million if he's elected, but he's going to murder everyone in the state of California. Neither one of us is in the state of California right now, so we would not that would not loop us in. It seems like you're doing something fundamentally wrong, not just morally, but from a democratic perspective, if you vote for the $10 million for you and your buddies, because you're sacrificing in this very grave way the interests of a whole lot of people. And and one of the features of American politics over the last decade or so is it feels like more people are in this kind of I want what's mine or I want what's benefiting me, and I don't really mind the the harm it inflicts on others. It feels more tribal than at least we have the perception that it used to be. It feels more grievance based and more of the purpose of politics is to benefit your friends and punish your enemies versus the purpose of politics is to find a way that we can peacefully coexist and improve the lives of everyone. So this is a long and potentially vague question, but I'll try to clarify it into two. First, does it feel like our democratic decision making and culture has shifted in that direction? Like, is there something to that? And if so, does that complicate the argument for democracy being a good itself versus some of these alternatives where you get the enlightened despot and they might be more enlightened than the 50% of people who want to get the $10 million but murder all of California?
Well, one thing is there is a degree beyond which that would not be an electorally successful platform once when you try to dole out those benefits to such a small number of people, even the wealthy who can help fund your campaign and that sort of thing. You do reach a limit beyond point which it is unpopular enough that you don't actually win elections. But when you're looking at how people vote and the interest and what motivates them, it's true, which some have mentioned as a criticism, as opposed to seeing it as the relatively desirable thing. People vote their interests. People vote their narrow. I'm a rational actor. I'm going to sit down and decide whether I would have more money under Trump or under Harris, and that's not really what happens. A vote is expressive. The thing that motivates people to vote is expressions of their identity and their beliefs. And it's on a broader level than just policy. Because, the average voter, it's true, is not a policy expert. They lack all this information. If you picked them and asked them to random citizens to run the government, they would have no idea what they're doing on all sorts of things. And so that's why we have to filter it through the representative system. But the thing about the alternative systems that are undemocratic, that amount to an autocracy of some sort or another, is that it's easier then. If those 10 people who are going to get the $10 million and murder all of California were the only people who get to vote, not even necessarily at a literal election, but in the sense of they're the stakeholders in the power system whose consent is necessary to seize and wield power, the kind of key holders at the top of the pyramid, that is much more feasible then for them to get away with. And this is why we see that democratic regimes make progress, and generally respect the most important fundamental rights in ways that undemocratic regimes are much worse on. I mean, there's no country in the world that respects human rights in the broadly liberal sense of it, not anarcho-capitalist, everything is an absolute right, property, all the rest of it, all taxes are legitimate. It's a gang of thieves writ large, as Rothbard put it. That is a different kind of entirely theoretical vision of how it could work. And that doesn't mean that there aren't good reasons to fight on the policy fight for democratic governments to have, cut taxes, have more free markets, do less harmful regulation, do not punish victimless crimes, and all these things. But the whole idea that you can get around that and come to an enlightened despot does not really work. There's a lot of truth in what Winston Churchill famously said: democracy is the worst system except for all the others that have been tried. And not just that have been tried in a real way that are theoretically even conceivable and don't collapse in their own contradiction.
We have had the system we have now for some time. And during much of that time, there were all kinds of anti democratic forces at play within it. It was doing monstrously unjust things like Jim Crow laws uh, under the democratic system and were being validated by the various checks and balances that existed in that system. And yet, it feels like there is more skepticism now about democracy and its institutions than there has been in quite a long time. That the right is convinced that our system is fundamentally corrupt and is every election that doesn't go their way has been stolen by nefarious actors through mechanisms that are often opaque. The left is convinced less of every election is stolen and more of structurally thumbs are on all sorts of scales, that the anti-democratic mechanisms within our democratic system have gotten out of hand, that we're on the verge of democratic collapse, etc. So, given that things are not necessarily worse from the perspective of democracies doing unjust things now or over the last 10 years than they've been at points in the past, what's going on? Like, why does there seem to be so much skepticism about democracy and its functioning itself?
Well, there are two key distinctions in there that kind of have to be separated out to analyze that history and the present situation. So if you go back to, the founding of the American Republic and the constitutional era, and that it was obviously true, as we all talk about and a lot, that this was a very limited franchise. It wasn't even just white men; it was white men with property in a lot of states, and but within that, it did have what was a functional limited franchise democracy. That the people who were voters were generally, at least by the standards of the day, free, had free speech. We had elections that weren't always perfect, but generally weren't completely rigged and stolen. And from that core of the limited franchise constitutional democracy, we then expanded that. And every time a new group was given the vote, the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, even I think you could have a good argument for 18 to 21-year-olds when that one happened, that went hand in hand with the reduction of those oppressions that they had previously been subject to. Their disenfranchisement was a key part of what enabled these worst injustices. It's not because they had a vote and were just outvoted. Black voters are not a majority in any state, including in the South. But when they were excluded at all, they became excluded from the political incentives. And so that feedback loop is a key part where you get the expansion of the franchise to be universal. And that's why I think there are important criticisms of felon disenfranchisement, of how difficult we make naturalization so that non-citizens who've lived here and are permanently are still excluded from the vote. But still, those account for a relatively, though sometimes significant, small chunk of the population. We have near universal adult franchise now. And we also have, I think, in a lot of ways, the peak of respecting rights and freedom. And this goes to the kind of anti-nostalgia point that Steve Horowitz and David Bowes would make, that, in fact, we are not in this doom and gloom decline of the government always gets bigger and freedom is always shrinking. In fact, even though some aspects of the government have grown bigger, our worst, most oppressive laws and policies have been overturned and have eventually we got LGBT equality, LGB at least, given the current disputes for the most part. And so this process is not separable. And if you look at, that's why the people who fought the most, the people who were on the leading edge of women's rights, the people who were on the leading edge in both Civil War and Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era for African-American rights, understood these things. And that's why they focused on that's what they were fighting for. Even if you go back to the American Revolution itself, that was about democratic representation and defending the autonomy of their own elected legislatures from being overridden by this other power they had no say in. And I don't think it's the case that you can find a very solid example of cases where the oppression of some minority group ended without their participation and enfranchisement in the electoral process. And when it comes to polarization today and the democratic backsliding and the problems we are having in a contemporary sense, you do have to distinguish out the overall, in a general sense, we're going to be a democracy, we're going to have elections, and we're not going to be a dictatorship or anything like that, from the designs of particular electoral systems and the incentives they create. And there's a whole broad range of things that have to be taken into consideration. So it is true, in a lot of ways, our electoral system is flawed. In some ways, our electoral system allows a relatively small, unrepresentative set in the primary elections to then go on and have the strict two-party system where they get a 50-50 toss-up of taking power. And we have the underrepresented representation of the middle, and then this all feeds back into public opinion and the growing tribalism and Duverger's law about having only two parties under our kind of electoral system kind of runs wild. And there are technological reasons why we have that nationalization of politics in recent years in a way that used to be held in check by the parties were more diverse regional coalitions. And that's why we didn't quite have this runaway polarization before. But that's the kind of thing we can and should and must, as the American experiment in self-government, correct those things and design better systems that still are in the broad sense democratic, but that have things like perhaps proportional representation. We can have the argument about how presidential elections should work and all these other things, but that's about improving democracy. That's not about moving in a less democratic direction. And it's not about necessarily unrolling the limits on government power. You can have a system that is more representative democratic in terms of the degree, the percentage of the voters and of society at large you need to get to win, to get in power, as distinct from the kind of, moving away from that. And we should have a, more interventionist government. We should roll back fundamental rights and have more majority rule on policy making. Those things are in important ways distinguishable. Any kind of state, short of going all the way to anarchism, and that's a whole separate discussion, but any kind of state is going to have, people running it, individual people you have to pick somehow. And no mechanism has proven itself superior at doing that other than having free and fair elections with a broad franchise.
You have spent a decent chunk of your career on exactly that question of free and fair elections, the mechanisms to hold them, the particular reforms we can implement in order to shore them up, reinforce them, and so on. So, what should we do now, given that there is this crisis of confidence in democracy, given that we have actual genuine threats to democracy in the form of some of our politicians and demands by sections of the electorate, and skepticism about the fairness on both sides have skepticism about the fairness of our elections, although it takes very different varieties depending on who you ask. Are there practical things that we can do to help correct the ship?
I do believe so, and that there has been some growing movement and still a lot of debate and disagreement about what's desirable, but still trying things and moving in the directions of structural electoral reforms that improve the representativeness of democratic election outcomes. So, one of the good things about the American constitutional system is we do have federalism. We do have these states that are able to write, within some limits, their own election rules. And so there's been movement towards, we're going to try things like ranked choice voting at the local level, and starting at the statewide level, there's been movements towards proportional representation. There are other various ideas in that vein. Multi-member districts is a common one that are both intended to improve the health of the democratic system in these states and cities where they're being adopted, but also serve as templates, the laboratories of democracy. And that has been the history of how a lot of these things happened. Yeah, that's how you eventually do build up to getting a constitutional amendment. It happened with women's suffrage. It happened with, black voting. It happened with 18 to 21-year-olds voting. 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, which a lot of libertarians hate, and I have my reasons. I think that hate is a little bit misplaced. But all of these things started in the states, and that is the genuine way that we can eventually start to build some consensus around the level of reforms needed. And that's not going to be the polarizing things, on the left. We're not going to abolish the Senate. We're not going to probably completely strip down the concept of judicial review in the way it's always existed in America. And, on the right, we're not going to, the vice president alone and the mob storming the Capitol and the rest of it doesn't get to decide who the president is. That's a more immediate anti-democratic threat in a real way. And it is urgent, and democracy is in a real sense on the ballot because of Trump's singularly extreme, I think you could safely say unprecedented in an American president, willingness to just totally throw out electoral democracy, and I'm going to be a dictator and I get to decide if I'm going to stay in power and all the rest of it. But that is something that's been made possible. And so when you're looking at the longer term reforms, how did we get into this mess and how do we get out of it and not have it again? Those do go to the things that are broader than Trump about the need to improve some aspects, at least, of our democratic system so that it's less polarizing. It doesn't produce this strong sorting effect where it's an existential crisis between the red blob and the blue blob, that you have a more diverse representation of the actual underlying diversity of interests and beliefs in the population as a whole, which we don't currently have in detrimental ways. And so that's kind of how I look at it is in the short term, we had to do things like reform the Electoral Count Act and establish better guidelines and procedures for how we're going to handle election disputes and, prosecute all the people who tried to attacked the Capitol and in more that criminal way tried to overturn the election. And then on the medium to long term, we have to keep an eye on what did produce within our democratic system and its imperfections, because nothing is perfect, as good as it is and served us for so long, there are always things we're discovering that are less than perfect about it. And so, it's a little bit sappy, but yes, eventually a more perfect union. And that is something that we need to keep an eye on. And I think it's important to recognize that's the broader coalition that does include, most Democrats out to the center right. The liberal coalition in the broadest sense is necessary to get to those structural constitutional reforms in a way that's not so narrow as, you just need all the Democrats to show up to win an election one time. So that's how I think it's worth looking at this moment of how we came to this crisis of democracy, where all of a sudden it's not a theoretical, not really on the table concern in the way it was in the post-war decades of the United States, in which libertarianism arose and was kind of fleshed out as a overall theory.
Thank you for joining us today. Now, here's a preview of the next episode of Reimagining Liberty, currently in early access for supporters.
Last year, 2023, a group of people who had contributed to the New York Times over the years wrote to the paper to say, your coverage of trans issues has been bad. You haven't quoted trans people in stories about trans issues. The obsession that you have with certain topics outweighs the actual amount of actual news coming out about this issue. And the Times just pushed back on it, saying it was from a group of activists. I was one of the people who signed that letter because I've had a couple things published by the paper. And it's frustrating to be labeled an activist because I happen to be trans. And so it does affect me personally. And it comes back to this idea of the default, the neutral, being straight, white, cisgender man. That is what's considered neutral. Anything outside that, if it's a person of color who's criticizing race coverage, well, they're clearly just an activist. They can't be objective because this affects them personally. But news affects all of us. If anything, people who are directly affected by these things have just as much authority to speak on them as those who aren't. And it's kind of weird that we romanticize this idea of this view from nowhere kind of journalism, where it's, I'm detached, I'm just observing, I'm just watching, and I don't have any skin in the game. And I think that until journalists can kind of get past that, until they can start to incorporate a wider range of voices, I don't think that we're going to really see much improvement on that.
If you'd like to listen to that conversation right now, you can by becoming a Reimagining Liberty supporter. Head to reimaginingliberty.com and click on Early Access to learn more.